Hello, welcome to this lecture on exercise at altitude. This is an overview slide. It basically corresponds with the major subheadings in your chapter, and it gives us an idea of what we're going to talk about throughout the rest of this lecture. So we're going to do an introductory slide before we get into environmental conditions. Barometric pressure, you can see abbreviated there as P with a sub B, is right around 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level. And the way that they determine that is you have an inverted kind of graduated cylinder that has a vacuum. You put it in basically a bowl of mercury, and the weight of the atmosphere that is pressing down on the mercury causes it to rise through that column. And you measure the height in millimeters, and that's how you can tell what the pressure is. And I should note that it's atmospheric pressure, so it's the combined molecules of oxygen and carbon dioxide and nitrogen. What we could do, and we're going to be interested in this throughout the remainder of this lecture, is we can take a look at specific molecules. And we're really interested in oxygen, because that's what we need in order to breathe and generate ATP. So we can determine what that partial pressure is of oxygen. And the way that we go about doing that is we know that the percentage of oxygen is 20.93 in the atmosphere. So we're going to convert it into a decimal, so 0.2093. We're going to multiply it by our millimeters of mercury. So if 760 represents 100%, we want to find out what basically 20.93% of the total is. So if you're using your calculator or your phone at home, take 0.2093 times 760, and it should come out to be pretty close to 159 millimeters of mercury at sea level. The next point down there is the last point under the partial pressure of oxygen bullet, is that the human body can withstand some fluctuations in the partial pressure of oxygen. However, once we start getting up at altitude, where it is severely reduced, this also limits exercise performance. And we're going to talk a good amount about that. Let's talk about one more definition. If something is referred to as hyperbaria or hypobaric, it is a reduced barometric pressure, and this is often seen at altitude. And a result of this reduced barometric pressure is hypoxia, or low oxygen, and hypoxemia, which is, as a result, a low partial pressure of oxygen in the bloodstream. So let's talk about environmental conditions at altitude. That's our first major heading. And your book starts off talking about 4 important scientists that have contributed to the field. So we'll talk about them really quick. First of all, there's Torricelli, and this scientist developed the mercury barometer. And really what it did was it allowed for an accurate measurement of atmospheric pressure. On the heels of that, once we can accurately measure it, Pascal was the one that demonstrated that this barometric pressure is reduced at higher altitudes. So a little bit further on after that, then Lavoisier came along and really described the makeup of this barometric pressure, and described that there were oxygen molecules and carbon dioxide molecules and nitrogen molecules that were contributing to this pressure. And then finally, Dalton came along, and you've probably, in your undergraduate exercise physiology class, learned about Dalton's law. Basically, it states that the total pressure exerted by a mixture of gases is equal to the sum of the partial pressures of the individual gases. So if we're interested in the atmosphere, it's made up of three gases. And if we want to determine what the total pressure is, all we need to do is figure out what each component is. So we take the amount that's attributed to oxygen and add it to the amount that can be attributed to carbon dioxide, and add that to the rather large amount from nitrogen, and then you have the total pressure. And then the last point on the slide here is in the late 1800s, probably right around the time where people were considering taking the first Everest trips. They figured out that there are some severe effects of hypoxia on the body. So we've got this slide and the next couple of slides that discuss environmental conditions in terms of altitude. So at sea level, and for us that's anywhere from 0 to less than 1,640 feet, we're going to say that there are no effects on performance. We've got low altitude, which again, translating this into American terms, is 1,640 feet, and the upper end of the range is 6,560 feet. So this is around the range that you find in Las Vegas. There are no effects on well-being. However, performance can be decreased, and it's usually performance above 4,920 feet, so about 5,000 feet, then it starts to decrease. And it's temporary. It can be restored by acclimatization back to lower altitudes. You've got moderate altitude, and the range for this is 6,560 feet all the way up to 9,840 feet. So if you take a drive north up I-15 and you start getting into some of those mountains in Utah, that's around the altitude that we'd be seeing. It does have effects on people that are unacclimatized to that altitude. As far as performance, performance will decrease, and aerobic capacity also decreases, and we'll talk about each one of these in more detail a little bit later on. And it's possible that the performance may or may not be restored upon acclimation. Moving on, we've got high altitude, and the range here is 9,840 feet to 18,000 feet. With this, it's possible to get acute mountain sickness, and again, we're going to talk about this later on. Performance decreases, and should note that this occurs in a large percentage of the population. There are some people that aren't affected as much, and these performance decrements are seen even after a period of acclimation. There are a couple of places in the United States, mostly found out west, where we do have altitudes this high. There are certain peaks called your 14ers that people like to try to hike up to. I think there are some of these in Yosemite National Park, Mount Whitney, which is on the border of Death Valley and the other side of California. Just for your information, I tried to look up and see what some of the highest actual cities are, and I found two of them. We've got Lhasa, Tibet, which is at 12,000 feet. It's in the Himalayas. There are 250,000 people that live there, and it's the home of the Dalai Lama. There's a place in Peru called La Rinconada that's at 16,700 feet. There are 30,000 people that live there at any one time. Most of them work in the gold mine. It's still operating, but what they'll do is they'll go up, they'll operate in the gold mine for a little bit, and then they'll go back down. So there aren't many people that live there in a sustained fashion. Okay, so moving on, we're going to define extreme high altitude as anything over 18,000 feet. You do see severe hypoxic effects at this altitude. The highest settlements are anywhere from 17,000 feet to 19,000 feet. However, as I talked about with the city in Peru, it's more transient. People can't live there all the time just because of the severe effects, and we're going to talk about these later on. So, for the purposes of your textbook, we're going to say that altitude is defined as anything over 1,500 meters, or right around 5,000 feet. And the reason for this is because there are few physiological effects below that altitude. All right, so we need to talk about something, and it's a common saying. A lot of times if you go to Denver, you're going to hear, oh, the air is thinner, and that's why it's harder to breathe. It's actually a little misleading. The barometric pressure, as you can see there, changes, but the actual composition of the air does not. You're always going to have atmosphere that consists of 20.93% oxygen and the same percentages for the other molecules. So in that sense, there's not less oxygen to go around. The difference is what happens with the partial pressure and the driving force. So if you take a look at that second main point there, barometric pressure at sea level is exerted by a 24-mile tall air column. Let me switch over to this picture. So if we're looking at Miami, Florida, which is at sea level, and basically you take a look straight up above it, you've got 24 miles of atmosphere, 24 miles of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen molecules pressing down upon it, creating the partial pressure that is 760 total, or a partial pressure of oxygen of 159. Now if we go back here, and if you take a look at the picture of the heart and the lungs there, I want you to take a look at the left-hand side so you can see inspired air, partial pressure of oxygen is, in this figure it's 160, we're going to call it 159. If you take a look at what's at the alveolus, partial pressure is 104. So you've got a difference of about 55 millimeters of mercury, which is pretty good, and it drives air from the atmosphere into the alveoli, and then eventually into the lungs and the bloodstream. Now if we go back to this picture, we've got Denver, which is a little bit higher altitude than Miami, Florida. In this case, rather than a 24-mile column of air, it's reduced to a 20-mile column of air. So you still have the same percentages. Oxygen is still 20.93. You just have 4 less miles of molecules that are pressing down. And because of that, the partial pressure of oxygen in the air at Denver is 132 millimeters of mercury. And if we go back to this picture, instead of partial pressure of oxygen being 160, it's now 130. And so you've decreased that driving pressure by about 20 or 30 millimeters of mercury. So it's a lot harder to get it into the lungs, or it seems like it's harder to get it into the lungs. So that's why people kind of misleadingly say the air is thinner. It's not so much. I mean, you have the same percentages. It's just there are less molecules and there's less partial pressure of oxygen. So let's follow this through. In Mexico City, there is only an 18-mile column of air above it. So you have a lot less molecules pressing down. At Pikes Peak, you have only 13.5 a 13.5 mile column of air. So it's a lot harder. The partial pressure of oxygen is much less. And then at Mount Everest, you only have an 8 mile column of air. So the actual molecules that are pressing down have been reduced by about 2/3 compared to Miami, Florida. So you can see why it's a lot harder to get air or oxygen from the atmosphere into the lungs just because of the reduction in the driving force of that partial pressure. So we're going to move on. We're going to talk about air temperature at altitude. You can see there in your notes that the temperature decreases about 1 degree Celsius for every, it's about 500 feet that you ascend. And I'm going to tell you a personal story here. I like to take my kids out hiking, and we decided to do the Black Mountain Trail out in Henderson. We got a little bit later start in the day. We left and probably got there about, I don't know, 2, 3 o'clock. It was probably closer to 3 o'clock. It was a pretty nice day, even though we left in February. So I only had the kids bring a light jacket. The trail starts out about 2,500 feet, and the very top of Black Mountain is about 5,100 feet. So as we started climbing, what we noticed was it got a lot colder. So I had the kids put on their jackets. The other thing is at that time of the year, the sun goes down a lot quicker. So we didn't make it all the way to the top, and I decided that it was in our best interest to turn around and go home and try it again a different day. But we did notice that it got colder, and one of the reasons why is because there's less up at the top of the mountain to block the wind going, and so really it got colder. We did see that temperature decrease. In addition to it, the sun starting to go down. But you do see very cold temperatures once you get to your higher altitudes, and this also contributes to your risk for cold-related disorders or your hyperthermia. Okay, so let's talk about humidity at altitude. And just like you have a barometric pressure and partial pressures for oxygen, partial pressures for carbon dioxide, water vapor also has its own partial pressure. And you can see there that cold air has very little water content in it. So the higher you get, the more dry and more cold it is. And one thing about having dry air, and we know this living in the desert, but having dry air will increase your dehydration through other means other than the regular conduction, convection, and so forth. And what you see is an increase in dehydration leaving through the skin and the lungs. This is called nonsensical evaporation or respiratory evaporation. So another thing that happens at altitude is that the intensity of solar radiation increases at higher altitudes. And there are a couple of reasons why this happens. So first of all, you have ultraviolet rays that are traveling through the atmosphere, and as we talked about, we have a less column of air as we increase in altitude. You have these molecules that can basically absorb radiation. So if at sea level I have 24 miles of these molecules versus at the top of Mount Everest I only have 8 miles, that's a lot less molecules to be able to absorb the radiation. So the ultraviolet rays basically they're traveling through a lower amount of atmosphere. All right, another thing that happens is that water also can normally absorb sun radiation, but like we just talked about in the slide before, there's a lower water content as you increase in altitude. So this increases the intensity of the solar radiation. And then finally, if you think about all the pictures that you've seen of Mount Everest, um, all, without exception, all of them have snow on it. You don't see Mount Everest covered with grass and daisies and things like that. Um, Snow also reflects and amplifies the solar radiation, so it makes it a lot more intense compared to your lower altitudes. So we're going to get into acute physiological responses, and it should be noted that what we talk about, it comes from research on healthy young individuals and mostly fit individuals. So if you're thinking about applying it to the elderly or to individuals that are not of a very high cardiorespiratory endurance, then you may want to take that into consideration. So one of the first responses that occurs, and it's pretty immediate, as soon as you arrive at altitude, you start to increase pulmonary ventilation, or just the volume of air that you're taking in and out of your lungs. This is seen at rest, it's seen at submaximal exercise, but not at maximal exercise. So we have a couple of physiological mechanisms that are at play that result in the increased pulmonary ventilation. Initially, you see a decrease in partial pressure, so that directly affects the chemoreceptors in the aortic arch, the chemoreceptors that are located in the carotid artery. And because of this, it stimulates the respiratory centers in the brain to increase both the rate and the depth of breathing. And because you're increasing primarily the depth of breathing, is reflected by an increase in tidal volume over the initial hours that you arrive at altitude, and it can last for the next several days. So those of you that have ever done a VO2 max test, think about how you breathe right at the end of the maximal test. You're breathing very heavily, and in that state you're blowing off extra carbon dioxide, and it's reflected in your respiratory exchange ratio. When you arrive at altitude and you increase your ventilation, it's similar to what's happening there at the end of the max test, although not quite as evident. You do have an increase in hyperventilation. And what's happening as you're hyperventilating, basically you're blowing off extra carbon dioxide. You're exhaling it. So you have a decrease in partial pressure of alveolar carbon dioxide, and this increases the carbon dioxide gradient. It actually makes it easier to lose carbon dioxide. And basically, as you're exhaling extra carbon dioxide, in that condition, you're left with excess bicarbonate, or that negative ion, and this results in respiratory alkalosis. And since we have extra bicarbonate, what our kidneys try to do is to excrete them. And as you excrete this bicarbonate ion, one of the effects is that it decreases the blood's buffering capacity. And I'll let you think on that as we get into consequences for exercise performance. And I kind of jumped the gun there with our discussion on respiratory alkalosis and kidney excretion of bicarbonate, but we'll go through these slides. So respiratory alkalosis, you're left with an excess of bicarbonate. You have a high blood pH, which means that your blood is less acidic. And one of the results of that is that you have your hemoglobin curve that shifts to the left. And this is our figure. So the red line is your regular oxygen dissociation curve, and the blue line is what happens with respiratory alkalosis. So it's shifting to the left. And basically, the way that you read this is for any given partial pressure, with the shift, you can pick up a greater percent of oxygen. So it's actually a benefit for you, or you have a greater saturation. So it's a benefit for you at higher altitudes. Another side effect of this is that it prevents any further hypoxia-driven hyperventilation. So it's a kind of a feedback loop type of thing, if you will. And then we talked about the second point there. The kidneys do excrete more bicarbonate. We talked about the result on buffering capacity, but the physiological benefit is that it brings the blood pH back to normal or near normal. So let's move on and let's talk about pulmonary diffusion. And with pulmonary diffusion, what we're talking about is movement of oxygen from the alveoli and getting it into the arterial bloodstream. Pulmonary diffusion at rest, at altitude, it doesn't limit gas exchange with the blood. At altitude, and the reason why is because at altitude, the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen is still equal to the capillary partial pressure of oxygen. However, we talked about as you increase your altitude, you do see hypoxemia or low arterial blood content occurring, and it's due, so the decrease of oxygen in the blood, it's not really due to the ability of the blood to diffuse. It's more a reflection of partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli. Okay, so let's talk about oxygen transport real quick. We just talked about there's a decrease in alveolar partial pressure of oxygen, and that results in a decrease in hemoglobin saturation. The byproduct of that is that this oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve shifts to the left, as we've shown you already. Okay, sorry for the interruption. I think we're getting ready to talk about the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. We talked about this in one context. Basically what we've got here is, if you take a look at the top part of the curve, this is partial pressure of about 100. That's where you're bringing oxygenated blood, or oxygen into the lung to then be picked up in the bloodstream. So this doesn't really change at altitude, other than the difficulty of trying to get it in there. But if you take a look at that top part, it's relatively flat, and it's a good thing because we can still oxygenate the majority of the blood that's coming into the lungs. And we've already mentioned that at altitude, the shape of this, the oxygen dissociation curve, moves to the left. So for any given partial pressure, and let's say at a partial pressure of 40, at normal altitude, let's say you dissociate or you give off about 30% of that, the oxygen, so it's still 70% bound, but at altitude you're only giving off maybe 18%, so you're still about 82% bound. So it's a little bit harder to give off oxygen to the tissues, but the benefit is that you kind of hold on to it. It's kind of like gold at a higher altitude, so you've got it if you need it. However, on the heels of us retaining saturation, if we talk about gas exchange that occurs in the muscle, there is a side effect. And this is that gas exchange is decreased in the muscle, and that's because the partial pressure of oxygen between the bloodstream and the musculature decreases. You can see there at sea level, there's a 60 millimeter mercury gradient. However, at altitude, there is a 15 millimeter mercury gradient. So it's a lot harder to drive that oxygen into the musculature. It represents up to 75% reduction in the diffusion gradient. So on the one hand, our hemoglobin retains or holds on to more of that oxygen, but the side effect as far as getting it to the muscles and then eventually on performance are somewhat significant. And that's followed up by that last major point there, that the location of the gradient change is critical. So up at the lungs, there's not as much of a difference, so there's little or no effect. Down there at the muscle or the working tissue, it's significant, so it ends up decreasing our exercise capacity. So in the previous chapter, we talked about physiological adaptations, and one of the major ones with endurance training is what happens with plasma volume. We're going to kind of retain that knowledge but flip it. So one of the short-term adaptations, or one of the short-term, it's not an adaptation, it's a physiological response that occurs to acute altitude exposure, is that you see a decrease in plasma volume. This occurs within the first few hours of arriving at altitude, but then it plateaus by the end of the first few weeks. What you see is you've got an increase in respiratory water loss, or that nonsensical water loss. As you increase the altitude, there's less water vapor, it's drier, so you lose a lot more that way. You also increase urine production, which decreases the liquid portion that you've got available to you. You can see there you lose up to 25% plasma volume, or that liquid portion of the blood. So basically what you're left with is a greater proportion of red blood cells. And because of that, you see a short-term increase in hematocrit. This does have some benefit because you have more red blood cells. You've got a greater ability to deliver oxygen to the muscle for any given cardiac output. And like I said before, regarding plasma volume, you can get it back up to a normal level with adequate fluid ingestion. The red blood cell count does increase. This is after a few weeks or months, and basically what you have is the hypoxemia triggering an erythropoietin release from the kidneys, and that serves to stimulate red blood cell production in the bone marrow. So, and this is more an adaptation, what you see is an increase in hematocrit in the long term. So this slide talks about cardiac output, and the cardiac output responds at rest and submaximal exercise. And what we see is an increase in cardiac output. And this is despite the decrease in plasma volume, which, as you can imagine, also results in a decrease in stroke volume. Basically what you have is, and it's interesting because as soon as you arrive at altitude, you invoke a sympathetic nervous system response that releases catecholamines such as your epinephrine and norepinephrine. And what happens is that this serves to increase your heart rate. So even though you've got a decrease in plasma volume and a decrease in stroke volume, since cardiac output is the product of heart rate and stroke volume, even though stroke volume is decreased, the increase in heart rate more than makes up for it. However, as you can imagine, this type of adaptation is something that you can't keep up for very long. So your book calls it an inefficient short-term adaptation, something that can be present for up to the first 6 to 10 days once you arrive at altitude. Afterward, you have to make some changes, and one of the big changes, especially as we're interested in submaximal exercise, is that the muscles start to extract more oxygen for any given intensity level. So you actually increase the AVO2 difference, and what happens is that this then results in a lower demand for cardiac output. So you don't have to maintain that increase in heart rate, which is a good thing. So the previous slide we talked about what happens during rest and submaximal exercise. This slide focuses in on maximal level exercise, and you see a lot of arrows pointing down here. And one thing kind of leads to the other. So at maximal exercise, you see a decrease in maximal cardiac output. That's due to both a decrease in stroke volume as well as a decrease in maximal heart rate. The stroke volume, as we've mentioned before, is due to a decrease in plasma volume, and it's thought that your decreased maximal heart rate is due to a decrease in your sympathetic nervous system responsiveness, possibly due to a decrease in the beta receptors and their ability to respond. So you put that together, you already know that there's a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen and its gradient. So the decrease in the driving force getting oxygen into the cardiovascular system, and couple that with a decrease in cardiac output at maximal levels, that the result is a decrease in maximal aerobic capacity at altitude. So there are some changes that occur to the metabolic rate also with acute exposure to altitude. We already talked about the increase in catecholamine secretion, but it's also shown that you increase thyroxine secretion, and both of these combine to have an effect on your basal metabolic rate. Another thing that happens is that your appetite declines. You're not as hungry, and because of this, you have to increase your food intake in order to maintain body mass. Another thing that happens is that there's a shift on reliance. You rely more on glucose and carbohydrates compared to fat. This is both at rest and submaximal exercise, and it's actually a benefit because the energy yield is much higher coming from carbohydrate than it is from fat. Actually, I shouldn't say that the energy yield is greater. What happens is for any given liter of oxygen, you generate more energy for carbohydrate than for fat, and since oxygen is at a premium at altitude, this is a beneficial adaptation. The last major point there, it can be summed up by something called the lactate paradox, and because I'm leaving this for a student presentation for later on in the semester, I'm not going to cover it because one of your classmates likely will. So this slide falls under the heading of nutritional needs at altitude. You You do get dehydrated much faster at altitude. You lose water through the skin, and there's a greater excretion rate through the kidneys and into the urine. Also, if you exercise or going outside, it can be exacerbated by sweating because there's a much larger evaporation gradient. So it's suggested that individuals consume at least 3 to 5 liters of fluid each day. It's quite a bit, and it should be tailored to individual needs. Your book also talks about that, so despite the adaptation that occurs, it's sound advice to stay well hydrated and also to allow the natural decrease in plasma volume to occur because there are some benefits associated with that adaptation, or sorry, with that response. And we already mentioned this, but your appetite decreases or declines when you're at altitude. So you take the decline and the desire to eat and pair it with your increase in metabolism, and you're facing around a 500 calorie per day deficit. So to offset that, you need to be aware that at altitude you need to eat more calories than your appetite suggests. Also, you need to maintain your iron intake, so eat iron-rich foods, maybe even take supplements, so that you can support that increase in hematocrit that's going to come along, and so that you can have adequate red blood cell production over the first 4 weeks of being at altitude. So we're going to move on and talk about exercise and sports performance at altitude. And it's important to note that altitude really has no effect on VO2 max until the partial pressure of oxygen drops below 131 millimeters of mercury. And this kind of corresponds to an altitude of about 1,500 meters, or around 5,000 feet, as we've been talking about it. And we've also already mentioned the physiological mechanisms for this decrease in VO2 max. You have a decrease in partial pressure of oxygen, and then a decrease in maximal cardiac output. And we'll take a look at this figure. Essentially, there's a linear decrease in VO2 max as you increase your altitude. And you can go back to this slide. You drop by about 8 to 11% for every 1,000 meters of ascent. Or, for us Americans, you can look at it as a 3% decrease for every 1,000 feet of increase. And there was a study that was conducted to Mount Everest, 1981, or that's when it was published, and there was a group of climbers, and they started off with an average VO2 max of 62 milliliters of kilogram per minute, and that was at sea level. And up toward the top of Mount Everest, their VO2 max had decreased to around 15, so that's pretty low. And it's something that a lot of people like to try, is to climb Mount Everest without the use of supplemental oxygen. And one of the things that they found was that if you had a VO2 max of less than 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute, you wouldn't be able to climb Mount Everest without the supplemental oxygen, because you wouldn't have enough aerobic capacity to get that oxygen in. Another thing to come out of that study is that, unlike the slide that I showed you before, once you get at very high altitudes, the decrease in VO2 max isn't linear. It's actually might even be steeper, a steeper decrease at very high altitudes. So in terms of what type of exercise is effective most at altitude, hopefully by now it's pretty self-evident, but aerobic exercise is the thing that's affected the most by the hypoxic conditions that you see at altitude. However, training state has something to do with that. People that have a larger VO2 max can perform a standard work with less perceived effort and less cardiovascular and respiratory stress than those that have a lower VO2 max. I'm going to go back a slide and again drive home this last point. If somebody had a VO2 max of less than 50, basically by the time they got up to the top of Mount Everest, that VO2 max would decrease to around 5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So essentially it wouldn't be hardly enough to provide for your resting metabolic rate, let alone exercise at a maximal level. And if we look at anaerobic performance, since we're not relying on oxygen as an energy source or energy producing source, anaerobic performance isn't affected. And supporting this evidence is that when the Olympic Games were held in Mexico City, which is at high altitude, there were world records that were set or tied in a lot of the sprinting events, such as the 100 meter, 200, 400, 800 meter, the long jump, triple jump, and even some of those relays. And people have gone back and looked at it and tried to explain why this happened. And essentially what they found was going back and looking at that column of air, at the higher altitude there's less actual molecules. So even though it might not seem to make a big difference, if you're talking about elite athletes moving their body through those molecules, they were able to shave some time off and come up with world records. So you had improved swim and run times and improved jump distances. With the throwing events, it varied. The shot put wasn't affected, and the discus actually decreased because you had less lift available because of the low barometric pressure. So we're going to switch gears here. We were talking about acute changes with, well, changes when you newly arrive at altitude. Now we're going to talk about what happens with prolonged exposure to altitude. And it's important to note that even though you can acclimate to some extent, the performance is never going to match what you're going to have at sea level. There are pulmonary, cardiovascular, and skeletal muscle changes that we're going to talk about. So starting at moderate altitude, which is right around 6,000 to maybe 10,000 feet, it takes about 3 weeks. And then for every 2,000 feet that you add in altitude, it takes an additional week to acclimate. And the bad news is that no matter how long you've spent acclimating, once you go back down to sea level, you lose it within a month. So the adaptation to the pulmonary system is one of the most important adaptations that occurs. Ventilation increases at rest and during submaximal exercise. I'm going to show you a figure that drives home this point. So there are a lot of figures on this. What you need to do is take a look at the left hand side, and the one in the middle represents ventilation. And you can see it's pretty low at sea level, and then within days of arriving at that altitude and continuing through weeks and months, we see an increase. And that increase at rest is about 40% higher than at sea level, and at submaximal exercise it can be as high as 50% higher. And this is a figure that represents what's happening at maximal exercise. Apparently your book doesn't think that it's important to actually talk about this, but they show a figure. And we're looking at the same place, so the left-hand side and the middle column. And at maximal exercise you can see that that compared to sea level, ventilation is significantly increased. So let's talk now about blood adaptations. And so you have erythropoietin that it starts to be released from the kidney within the first 3 hours of arriving at altitude, and it is continued to be released for the next 2 or 3 days. So there's a significant increase in response to altitude. And as a result, it stimulates a condition called polycythemia. It's the medical term for an increase in red blood cell count. And eventually, due to this adaptation, you have an increase in hematocrit. So if we take a look back at this figure, at the bottom of the left-hand set of graphs, you'll see hemoglobin concentration, which goes down in the couple of days after. And your book says this is due to plasma volume expansion, so you have an initial drop in plasma volume followed by a recovery, and I think that because of the recovery, you have a greater liquid portion, and this serves to drop the hemoglobin concentration. But then once erythropoietin has a chance to kick in and start generating more red blood cells, then after weeks and months of adaptation, you see a significant increase. And it's interesting that the red blood cell count remains elevated, and you can see for up to 3 months or maybe even more, even though erythropoietin levels drop back down to normal. And this slide talks a little bit further about polycythemia. Hematocrit levels are about 45% at sea level. They increase with altitude. And it's interesting to note that hemoglobin increases in a proportional manner to the elevation. And this is an interesting slide that was, or figure, that shows you hemoglobin concentration for various residents who are living at different altitudes. And you can see the linear increase here. And let's talk about the last sub-point under the first main bullet point there. The oxyhemoglobin curve may or may not shift. And that sounds a little ambiguous. The reason why is you have a couple of competing physiological things that are going on. You have 2,3-diphosphoglycerate, or 2,3-DPG, that increases in your red blood cells, and the physiological consequence of this is that it facilitates unloading of oxygen, which would be a benefit if you're doing exercise. On the other hand, you have respiratory alkalosis at lower partial pressures of oxygen, and we talked about this already. With this, it maintains loading. So it's possible that these two competing mechanisms may actually cancel out, and you might not see anything happen with your oxyhemoglobin curve. Okay, so let's go back and let's talk about plasma volume. You know that initially plasma volume decreases, and then after a little bit it rebounds, and that it results in an increased plasma volume or plasma expansion. So the initial early loss, the result is that you have an increase in hematocrit prior to the induced polycythemia from the erythropoietin. However, once you rebound, the later increase in plasma volume results in increase in ability to carry out stroke volume, as well as an increase in cardiac output, and this could lead to an increase in performance with acclimation, but again, not to the levels that have been seen at sea level. So there are also changes that occur with prolonged exposure to altitude that happen to the musculature, and this, what we know, comes from studies on climbers that have been exposed to about 4 to 6 weeks of hypoxia. And what they've seen is that cross-sectional area of the muscle fibers decreases, and this decreases the total muscle area. Because we're trying to get more blood and oxygen to the working tissues, you do see an increase in capillary density, and you also see decrease in muscle mass due to weight loss. It's possible that you have protein wasting and possibly due to appetite loss. You also see a decrease in the muscle metabolic potential. You see a decrease in mitochondrial function and glycolytic enzymes after about 4 weeks of exposure. And then you also see a decrease in oxidative capacity enzymes, and this affects your ability to generate ATP. So if we take a look at cardiovascular adaptations, there was a study that was done in the 1960s where they took endurance-trained runners up to altitude, and they had them train for 2 months, and what happened was that you saw the expected decrease in VO2 max initially, and after 2 months you didn't see any increases in VO2 max, which was kind of unexpected. They were more tolerant of the hypoxic condition. However, they didn't see any changes in VO2 max or running performance. And it was unexpected. They thought that these athletes would be able to acclimate and after 2 months show an increase in VO2 max compared to their initial VO2 max levels upon arriving at altitude. And they thought that it might have been reduced, or they might not have seen any changes because the reduction in partial pressure of oxygen also had an effect on how intense these athletes were able to perform. And I'm going to also throw out there, it might also be possible that the athletes were already at their genetic predetermined limit, and if that was the case, then they wouldn't be able to increase VO2 max anymore. Okay, there are a couple of slides that if you're following along at home in your notes, I'm leaving in there. These are on optimizing training at performance, kind of the live high, live high, train low, train high, live low. That combination, which I'm going to leave it for a student report, so you're going to get this later on in the semester. So we're going to skip ahead a few slides. So we're going to switch topics again, and we're going to end off our lecture talking about health risks to acute altitude exposure. And this slide we're going to start with the condition that is the least harmful, and we're going to progress and talk about a few more that are more harmful in levels of degree. And this slide is really kind of characterizing acute altitude sickness or mountain sickness. So you can see there, if somebody is going to get it, you have the onset that begins within the first 6 hours after arrival, anywhere up to the 2 days after arriving, and it becomes the most severe 2 to 3 days after arriving at altitude. Symptoms include headache, nausea, vomiting, and so forth. And if not checked, it can develop into your more lethal conditions. And I should say that headache is the most common symptom, and alcohol consumption seems to make it worse. And we're going to talk on the next slide about theories or underlying physiological mechanisms that have been proposed for this. I should say that not everybody gets this. There seem to be some individuals that have the perfect storm of traits or responses that allow them to not be as affected, and then other people are more affected. So when we talk about incidence, it seems to increase with altitude, increase with how fast you ascend, and underlying physiological susceptibility. You've got a point there that says the frequency is anywhere from 7 to 22%. There's a slide here, and right now what we're looking at is the left-hand side of it where it says prevalence of acute altitude sickness. And they've looked at tourists, they've looked at experienced climbers that have a rapid ascent or experienced climbers that take it a little slower. So you can imagine there's quite a range. And there's also a range depending on the study that you read. So in some cases, there are as little as 0 to 1% of individuals that get it. In other cases, and this isn't on the slide here, but your textbook refers to a study where it was reported that 80% of the individuals had symptoms of altitude sickness. So I need to say that we don't know why some people get it and some people don't. So this first point here is, it said possible causes. That means we don't know, but the thinking is that there are some people that have a low ventilatory response when they arrive at altitude. Or in other words, they are presented with a hypoxic situation and they don't increase ventilation like they should to get the benefits of it. So then the consequence is they're not getting enough oxygen and carbon dioxide isn't being expelled. So carbon dioxide accumulates and you have this situation where you create an acidotic state. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, headache is the most common symptom. Your textbook says that you don't have many incidents below 8,000 feet, but once you get above 12,000 feet, then it hits the majority of people. It manifests as a continuous and throbbing sensation. For some reason, it's worse in the morning, and it's worse after exercise, potentially because you have opened up the capillaries, you have an increase in blood going to the brain, and you might also be stretching the pain receptors and activating them. Another thing that happens with altitude sickness is something called, basically you've got insomnia, so the inability to sleep even though the person is really, really fatigued. It messes with your sleep cycle so that you don't get a really good and satisfied night's worth of sleep. Also, some people with this sleep insomnia or this altitude insomnia have a pattern of breathing as they sleep that's called Cheyenne-Stokes. And in this pattern, basically it's alternating periods of rapid breathing and then slow, shallow breathing. And then it also includes periods where breathing completely stops. And as you can imagine, this does not contribute to a good night's sleep. And there's a study by West that I have included in our materials. And basically what they found was that this incidence of irregular breathing increased as you go up in altitude. So about 8,000 feet there was a 24% incidence. Going up to 14,000 feet there was a 40% incidence. And then near 20,000, 21,000 feet almost everybody experienced this. So if you have a trip planned to Mount Everest, what can you do to prevent this altitude sickness from setting in? Well, one of the things is that they do is they recommend a gradual ascent into altitude. So starting about 10,000 feet and then not going up more than 1,000 feet in elevation per day. And that's why some of these trips take 2 to 3 months to complete. In addition, you can take a drug, and you can see it there. It's the only kind of preventative treatment available, started a day or so beforehand. And in some cases they'll take this and combine it with steroids. Another thing, especially if you're climbing Everest and so forth, is to take oxygen supplementation or artificial oxygen. And then in severe cases, if you have altitude sickness, is to use the aid of hyperbaric rescue bags. So your acute altitude sickness can progress into two life-threatening conditions. Both of them involve the formation of edema, and it just depends where this occurs as to what we label it. You can see there one is high-altitude pulmonary edema, so it occurs in the lungs, and then the other one is high-altitude cerebral edema occurring in the brain. If you're on a climbing expedition and somebody develops one of these two, you will want to treat them immediately. Let's talk about high-altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE, first. And the proposed mechanism is with extreme high altitude, then you have pulmonary vasoconstriction that occurs, and you have clots forming in the circulatory system in the lungs. Due to these clots, you have basically the lung tissue becomes overperfused, and then you have extra fluid and protein leaking out of the capillaries. The symptoms you can see there: shortness of breath due to the fluid buildup in the lungs, wet cough, you've got tightness, and then associated fatigue. Because you can't get enough oxygenated blood, then you have the onset of cyanosis. In addition, because you don't have enough oxygen being circulated, you've got confusion and unconsciousness that occurs. And then to treat it, you administer supplemental oxygen and then get them to a lower altitude as quickly as possible. So this last condition, high altitude cerebral edema, a lot of times it'll progress from the pulmonary edema and progress into this HACE. It occurs as a complication mostly over 14,000 feet of altitude. And essentially what happens is that you have a buildup of fluid and pressure in the cranium. And because of that, it leads to symptoms such as confusion, being extremely tired, lethargic, and difficulty walking, which is not a good thing to happen to you, especially if you're trying to climb to the top of the mountain. Other symptoms are unconsciousness and eventually death. So treatment is supplemental oxygen, placement in a hyperbaric bag, and then immediate descent to a lower altitude.